People who violently suppress student speech in defense of the ruling class have a long track record of landing pretty squarely on the wrong side of history. And yet,
they're being treated like terrorists.
Seems kind of privilegey.
I have determined that the building occupation, the encampments, and related disruptions pose a clear and present danger to persons, property, and the substantial functioning of the university.
Enjoy your free speech.
On October 7th, 2023, an estimated 1,200 Israelis were killed and 240 hostages were abducted by the militant political group Hamas, whose stated goal is the dissolution of Israel and the creation of an Islamic Palestinian state in its place. In the 6 months since, Israel has retaliated with brutal force, bombing hospitals, leveling safe zones, blocking and even attacking humanitarian aid. More than 34,000 Palestinians have died, 14,000 of them children. 7,000 people are missing, and nearly 2 million people, 85% of the population, have been displaced. The images flooding social media have been horrific and have successfully activated global support for a permanent ceasefire in the face of what is clearly a genocide orchestrated by a US-backed ally. In the past few weeks, that global backlash has manifested itself across college campuses in the form of mass student protests, many of which have been met with brutal force. There's a lot of precedent for student protests as the impetus for mass social movements, especially in the 20th century, from civil rights and the Vietnam War to South African apartheid and gun control. What can these past movements teach us about the impact of student protest movements today? Do they really make a difference? Are school administrators always in the wrong? Is there ever an instance where calling in the National Guard on a bunch of 20-year-olds holding a sit-in is justified? Why is student activism so inspiring for some while others are quick to dismiss it? This is why student protests could save democracy. Roll the intro. Thank you to my partner on today's video, Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen meals straight to your doorstep that are truly and legitimately, I cannot stress this enough, the best prepared meals I have ever had. And the flavor and the pizzazz, they just get it. The ease of just popping them into the microwave for 2 minutes with no prep or cleanup. For me, an ADHD girly, I cannot tell you how much of a lifesaver Factor is. And the weather is getting warmer, and y'all, I am a sweater. I sweat in this heat, and I do not want to be in the kitchen with the oven on or over a hot stove. Yuck. But I also have health goals that are really hard to achieve when I have nothing to reach for and end up just microwaving some chicken nuggets like a toddler. But not with Factor. I know I'm getting a chef-prepared meal that includes actual vegetables and tastes amazing. They have a weekly menu of 35 options, including options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie. They also have add-ons like breakfasts, snacks, and beverages, so you never have to worry about anything. I recently tried Factor's cavatappi and Italian-style pork ragu, and it was so flavorful, and look, ma, came with a side of garlic broccoli, so we're keeping it healthy in here. So what are you waiting for? Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Leeja50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Thanks, Factor. On April 18th, school administrators called police to disband a large pro-Palestinian demonstration at Columbia University that had formed as more and more students began calling for Columbia to divest from Israel. More than 100 protesters were arrested. Protests at universities across the country were quick to follow. On April 29th, hundreds of Columbia students refused to vacate an encampment they had built on the university's main lawn. Encampments are a form of nonviolent intervention designed to disrupt daily activity and make negotiations more urgent. Social media posts depicted an encampment at Columbia where students gathered for daily prayer and meditation, set up medic tents, served food, created a library, and provided peer social services. Reports were that the encampment was largely peaceful. The students' refusal to vacate on April 29th violated the school's deadline, and in the early hours of April 30th, dozens of protesters broke into Hamilton Hall and barricaded themselves inside, hanging a banner to rename it Heinz Hall in honor of a 6-year-old Palestinian girl who had been killed, along with her family family and the EMTs attempting to save them by Israeli tanks in Gaza. The occupying students asked for Colombia to divest its funds from Israel, sought greater financial transparency, and requested amnesty for protesters. The next day, police escorted the protesters out of Hamilton Hall with hands zip-tied. NYPD Commissioner 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 said he'd charged the occupiers with criminal mischief, trespassing, and burglary, a felony. At least one billionaire donor has pulled his support from the university, saying the school has failed to protect Jewish students, only some of whom I might add are Zionists. Zionism is, of course, a complicated subject with over 100 years of history. Yes, it predates Israel, and this video isn't about diving into that history, though I will say I think that it is very easy to say, well, the history is so complex, so I really can't form an opinion on it, as an easy out for just learning the basics, because even with the basics, the truth becomes pretty clear. Zionists believe the Jewish state of Israel is entitled to rule the land it currently occupies. Occupy being the key word. The West basically carved Israel out of already inhabited land in the wake of World War II under the guise of apologizing for the Holocaust, but also really conveniently giving themselves a stronghold in a hostile yet politically valuable region. The land Israel currently occupies wasn't even the only land they were looking at. At one point, Argentina was on the table. But instead, they picked the most hotly contested holy land in the world where multiple religions converge in their scripture and feelings of connection, and they said, oh, this? Yeah, this is ours now. And that suited the West just fine because it gave them a cozy ally in a region rich with oil and also rich with complex and often hostile feelings towards the West. However, Zionism is not fundamental to Judaism, and the persistent conflation of criticizing the Israeli government with anti-Semitism has made it almost impossible to have a meaningful conversation about it. Many Jewish progressives have joined pro-Palestine protests and condemned the genocide being carried out in their name. Some Israeli citizens condemn the actions of the Israeli state. To say that the entire Jewish population is a monolith that can fall under the category of Zionism is actually anti-Semitic in itself. And of course, anti-Semitism words and actions should be condemned whenever they happen. Anti-Semitism has no place in the world, period. But screaming anti-Semitism wherever there's criticism of the Israeli government is an easy distraction from what's really going on. In the legal field, we'd call this a straw man argument. We're saying one thing, hey, genocide is bad, and the state of Israel should stop doing that, and the US should stop supporting it. And the state of Israel and its protectors then say, hey, but anti-Semitism. Okay, what about it? That's not what I was talking about. Criticizing the actions of a state is not the same as criticizing a religious and ethnic group of people. And I think we should always question if you conflate criticism of a state with criticism of you as a person. Do you identify that closely with the state? That's problematic, friend. That's brainwashing, buddy. That's propaganda. Unquestioned loyalty to a state is creepy, my dude. Anyway, it's all to distract from what's really happening, which is a genocide, while the entire world watches. And the US is extremely invested in Israel. Since its founding in 1946, we've given Israel around $300 billion in economic and military support, making Israel the single largest cumulative recipient of US foreign aid, period. Our higher education institutes also have a lot of skin in this game. Some have weapons development contracts benefiting Israel. Top secret stock portfolios are peppered with investments in Israeli firms or firms that invest in products made by Israeli firms. Wealthy donors whose families, fortunes, or both have ties to Israel. Our higher institutions literally make bank when the world goes to war. And this TikTok user, a Palestinian PhD student at Columbia, pointed out the further hypocrisy.
Not only do they invest in the war industry, but they also build these departments that preach liberal democracy and human rights, and they write books and they profit in other ways. And yet that's the inherent hypocrisy of Western education. It's preaching human rights and yet funding the destruction of humanity.
Perhaps most insidiously, however, in some places it's illegal for public universities to make moves against Israel, written into law. In Ohio, public universities are prohibited from contracting with companies that are boycotting or divesting from Israel. Seems weird that they would have to stipulate that, almost like they saw this coming, but I digress. Now that you've got the backdrop, let's zoom out a little to examine the patterns we see in the present and how they map onto the past. Where have schools drawn the line between campus safety and free speech in the past, and what does the law say about it? Private institutions, including schools, aren't required to honor constitutional rights. Brigham Young University is within its rights to have its dress code and bans on cussing. Still, the Supreme Court has found that places of education require a special lens to determine issues of free speech and expression, and most colleges promise students the right to free speech as part of a more significant commitment to academic freedom. Academic freedom protects the rights of students and professors to learn, teach, research, publish, and mount political critiques without fear of retribution. And history has demonstrated over and over the importance of academic freedom to functioning democracies. The Supreme Court has heard numerous cases about students' rights to protest and the limits of free speech on campus. Yet some lines remain frustratingly blurred. In 1969, the court ruled that students don't shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. A few years later, it affirmed that administrators could not restrict free speech or association simply because it finds the views expressed by any group to be abhorrent. However, the Supreme Court has also upheld disciplinary action for students whose speech was deemed too disruptive. For example, in the case of a student who took a large banner with the words "Bong hits for Jesus" to an off-campus event. Bong hits for Jesus, too disruptive. If you've ever tried to wear a spaghetti-strapped tank top to an American middle school, you understand how subjective the definition of disruptive can be. Basically, schools and universities have the right to prohibit expression so long as it's not on the basis of the substance of that expression. So yes, they can ban hats. No, they cannot ban only those pink pussy hats or only hats that are pro-NRA, for example. So yeah, students have the right to protest, but there is no bright line rule, and the consequences depend largely on what each institution is willing to tolerate. And that has varied widely with the current student protests, with Evergreen State College in Washington agreeing with students to begin exploring divestment, to the University of Texas at Austin calling in state troopers almost immediately when protests began. However, when students engage in civil disobedience in ways that violate campus policy or the law, they are subject to consequences. You can't block traffic without a permit. You can't occupy private property without permission. Is the Quad at UCLA, a public college and a space open to and funded by the public, off limits for public protests, including encampments? That's a murkier question. The problem with all of this is that because First Amendment rights are a moving target that depend entirely on the facts of each individual incident, colleges and universities have some guidelines from the Supreme Court to follow, but then ultimately get to make whatever call they want in the moment. It's only through lawsuits brought after the fact that we can determine whether or not their actions amount to violations of students' constitutional rights. So while the Constitution is murky, I think the important distinction to remember is that between the law and the school's policy. The law says you cannot trespass, and there are legal consequences that you can face. The school policy is not the law, but where you violate school policy, you could face consequences from the school, even if you didn't break the law. But breaking school policies and even breaking the law are necessary parts of the nonviolent playbook, as we've seen throughout history. Gene Sharp, author of 198 Methods of Nonviolent Action, divides nonviolent tactics into 3 categories. Protest and persuasion refers to public assemblies, banners, formal statements from organizations, processions, and the like. These are minimally disruptive, but involve someone standing up and making a point to say, "Hi, this is important." Then there are methods of non-cooperation, which include economic boycotts, student walkouts, and workplace strikes. These can be disciplined, but are legally protected. So you might get detention for walking out of class, but you wouldn't get arrested for it. Finally, there's nonviolent intervention, the sit-ins, land seizures, civil disobedience, and encampments. Nonviolent interventions are potent because they actively disrupt regular daily activity. By posing a direct and urgent challenge to the status quo, nonviolent interventions are much more difficult for authorities to withstand for long periods. By their very nature, they are meant to be disruptive. That is the point. Most successful student protests in history have involved that third category, nonviolent interventions. Let's just take a snapshot look at some of the most notable student movements of the 20th century. The Greensboro Four, the group that initiated the lunch counter sit-ins that were paramount to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, they were a bunch of college kids. Their first lunch counter sit-in exploded into a 300-person protest and led to the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, an influential student coalition that helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Their choice to participate in sit-ins that broke the very Jim Crow laws they were protesting against helped create societal change. Just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's wrong. Say it with me. Just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's wrong. Sometimes it does, but sometimes also it doesn't. And while many people in the North praised the sit-ins at the time for their nonviolence, the protesters faced harassment and assault during their sit-ins and were seen by many Southerners as criminals, breaking the law and upsetting the natural, peaceful order that had been established in the Jim Crow South. Columbia was also a hotbed for numerous protests in the 20th century, usually in April. I don't know if it's the leaving the dark of winter, new energy with more daylight hours or something, but there's something about April. In April 1968, student groups occupied Hamilton Hall and 4 other buildings, briefly holding the dean of Columbia College hostage. This led to a month-long strike that culminated in the brutal arrest of more than 700 students. One witness said that he and his friends who'd opposed the protesters for inconveniencing their education actually switched sides just because the cops were nuts. The demonstrators were protesting many things: the national draft and Columbia's involvement with a think tank during war research for the Pentagon. The school also planned to build a new gym in Morningside Park, a chunk of already scarce public green space in majority black Harlem. According to 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗛, a Columbia student activist, at that point it wasn't a question of what career you were going to choose. It was a question of whether the country would survive a civil war. It sounds pretty familiar. Again, in April 1985, Columbia students protested for 3 weeks for the administration to divest from apartheid South Africa. About 150 students blocked access to the entrance of a campus building, and a few months later, trustees voted to sell stock in companies still doing business in South Africa, a total of $39 million in investments, about 4% of Columbia's total portfolio, and including notable stocks such as Amex, Chevron, Ford, and Coca-Cola. After Columbia became the first Ivy League school to divest from firms that supported or profited from South African apartheid, 155 other schools followed suit. The following year, the U.S. government enacted its own divestment policy. South African apartheid officially ended in 1994. Like the pro-Palestinian protesters today, U.S. students were part of an international chorus calling for the end to South African apartheid policies. One key difference was that American elites overall harbored a lot of embarrassment about being complicit with South Africa's white government. So, says David Farber, a history professor at the University of Kansas, specializing in American activism, it wasn't really a polarizing issue. It was kind of pushing against an open door. From a financial standpoint, the U.S. didn't stand to lose a ton from divesting in South Africa. Many of its goods could be substituted with products from other places. Furthermore, more than 70% of South African exports in 1990 were below median world quality. So in terms of cost benefit to the people in power, this was an easy win without a huge downside. It would be much more complicated and more expensive to divest from Israel today, politically and financially, which is what universities and their defenders argue when asked to divest. It's not possible, and students are being stupid, naive, and unrealistic when asking for such impossible outcomes. Brainwashed, woke, leftist, privileged snowflakes. Get your kid into college by any means necessary, but then hate them for getting the wrong kind of education, putting too many woke ideas in their heads. At least that's what those who poo-poo student protesters believe. And their refrain is familiar because it's nothing new and falls directly in line with the far-right boogeyman of the elite leftist brainwashing taking hold in our institutions of higher learning. And the narrative that schools need to be prevented from breeding liberal hellions goes back to the 60s. The pieces started coming together in 1966, in part thanks to the campaign promises of one California governor, Ronald fucking Reagan. Did you know on Patreon you can get early access to these videos ad-free? Thank you to my Patreon community and my YouTube members for supporting the research and work that goes into these videos. Consider checking out my Patreon community or clicking the big join button below to become a member here on YouTube. You'll be supporting my work and getting access to early, ad-free, uncensored versions of all these videos, as well as access to my research and all my sources, exclusive live streams, and more. Your support helps to keep these videos free for everyone and further our mission towards legal and political education for all. These days, we tend to look back on the Vietnam War protests and think it's really clear that the universities got it wrong, that sending in the National Guard was wrong, that this clearly led to the tragedy at Kent State when 4 students were gunned down in 1970 during student protests against the war there, that everyone at the time saw what the state was doing and saw the Vietnam War and thought it was wrong. But the reality is that at the time, plenty of people were like, fuck those pretentious scumbags, they had it coming. 3 days prior to the Kent State massacre, President Nixon had called the protesters on college campuses across the country bums who were blowing up the campuses. Joseph R. Biden himself, in his own memoir, recalls being a law student in Syracuse in 1968, seeing students hanging a banner in support of the student movement organization Students for a Democratic Society, and thinking they were a bunch of assholes. His word, not mine, in his own memoir. In the years before his 1968 assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. became vehemently outspoken in his opposition to the Vietnam War, earning him extensive criticism because at the time, being against the Vietnam War was a deeply unpopular opinion. It wasn't until well into the 1970s, in part spurred on because of the student deaths at Kent State, that widespread realization finally hit that we were fighting an unwinnable, unconscionable war at incredibly high human cost, that maybe those students were onto something. So it's hard not to feel like history is repeating itself when you see police and National Guardsmen squashing student protests in the name of a war that is incredibly unconscionable, backed by powerful politicians and also a large swath of the US population who think those kids are just up to no good, just a bunch of law-breaking hooligans, and we're somehow the good guys because we're defending Israel's right to protect itself by genociding an entire population. Oh, but how does Ronald fucking Reagan play into this? So glad you asked. In his 1966 campaign for governor, Ronald Reagan promised to clean up the mess at Berkeley, referring to the barrage of protests on campuses across the state of California. Students spoke up about everything from the draft and civil rights to discrimination and women's liberation. And Reagan was like, nah, the only thing wrong with this country is you beatniks, radicals, and filthy speech advocates. So once Reagan was elected, he launched an assault on the University of California system. Up until this point, the University of California system offered higher education for free, but not on Ronnie's watch. He proposed cutting the UC budget by 10% across the board and instituting tuition fees. The legislature said no to some of it, but lesser funding cuts were imposed and new fees were implemented. The door to charging tuition was opened. In 1965, it was free for California students to attend any UC school. Today, 4 years of in-state tuition is about $60,000. In his own words, Reagan believed charging tuition would get rid of undesirables. Those who are there to carry signs and not to study might think twice to carry picket signs. This attitude caught on, and other public university systems soon turned their back on free higher education. Later, as president, Reagan rallied Congress to pass cuts to federal student aid, forcing out the students regarded as undeserving, just like his favorite boogeyman, the welfare queen. Quit giving the poor all these free handouts. The conservative consensus was that students were just an economic drain on the country, so taxpayers shouldn't have to fund their financial aid, their parents should do it. And if they can't, the students should just take out loans. If they're studying something valuable, as in valuable to capitalism, they shouldn't have any problem paying those loans back, right? This is how we ended up with the infantilizing rhetoric we still hear thrown at college students today. You're wasting your parents' money that we forced you to rely on.
Go back to class and stop the nonsense. Stop wasting your parents' money.
The skyrocketing cost of education and huge student debt burden means that liberal arts education is falling out of fashion. The academy originally existed to produce ethical, widely knowledgeable, and highly articulate young adults, at least in theory, which sounds dangerous, especially if the students don't care about preserving the wealth of already wealthy people. So now getting a college degree that won't land you a lucrative job in STEM is derided as impractical and wasteful. It's all part of the same right-wing assault on liberal academia, because if you educate the proletariat and they learn about the ways you've been fucking them over, they're much more likely to revolt. And no, I'm not being hyperbolic. In 1970, when Governor Reagan shut down the entire UC system in the face of growing anti-war protests, his education advisor, Roger Freeman, spoke at a press conference in his defense. He said, and I quote, "We are in danger of producing an educated proletariat. That's dynamite. We have to be selective on who we allow to go to college. If not, we will have a large number of highly trained and unemployed people," which, according to Freeman, is what leads to fascism, comparing the situation to Nazi Germany in the 30s. The fact that the reason why our institutions of higher learning have gotten so expensive and led to an insurmountable student debt crisis is based, at least in part, on this little tidbit of history should be horrifying. And it's all the more proof why college and university campuses are hotbeds for this type of protest and the ensuing public outrage. The point is to try to train us to make people richer and spur on capitalism, not engage in critical thought and imagine alternative systems. And it's that very skill, especially in young people, that make them the impetus for this kind of movement. That's part of the power of young activists. They aren't as attached to the way things are, so they're more capable of imagining something new. And Gen Zers seem especially ready to activate for a cause. In 2016, UCLA's annual survey of undergraduates found that 1 in 10 students expected to participate in protests while in college. That's the highest rate since 1967. A more recent study from Tufts found that 1 in 7 youth had already participated in a march or demonstration, and about a third said they'd participate if given the opportunity. Gen Zers are used to fighting for their lives on everything from climate change to gun control, so it shouldn't be that surprising to see them so activated, especially given the fact that these students, the college graduating class of 2024, are the same students who were grade schoolers during the Sandy Hook shooting, and 4 years ago saw their high school graduations canceled and their worlds turned upside down by the COVID pandemic. These kids have not known normal for their entire adult lives, so of course they're willing to push against the status quo. The way things are has never served them. And they've seen protests work. In 2018, 5 survivors of the Parkland High School massacre that left 17 dead organized a national March for Our Lives protest demanding stricter background checks for gun buyers. More than 1 million people marched in the US, plus millions more across 6 continents. It was one of the largest youth protests since the Vietnam War era, and they organized it in 5 weeks. That's another thing about youth protesters. They're particularly good at leveraging the latest technology to get the word out. In the 1960s, they used mimeographs and laser printings, and today it's Google Docs and the Signal app. In the year after the Parkland massacre and protests, state legislatures passed 67 gun control or gun violence prevention bills. 8 states and Washington, D.C. passed red flag laws, allowing family members or law enforcement officers to petition a court to temporarily block a high-risk person from owning or buying firearms. And while none of that fully fixed our country's gun control problem, at least it moved the needle in the right direction. Marshall Gantz, a senior lecturer at the Kennedy School who spent 16 years as the United Farm Workers Director of Organizing, identifies 3 essential tools for political and social renewal that young people tend to have in spades: a critical eye of the world, a clear view of its needs and pain, and hopeful hearts that give a sense of the world's promise and possibilities. We've already touched on these first 2 points. Young people, especially educated ones, know enough to see the big picture, but haven't yet been swallowed by it. For many, college campuses offer a liminal space between childhood and adulthood. And though this perspective gives them their power, it also draws a ton of heat from critics. The same people who turned higher education into a privilege factory in the first place are the ones furious about how students are now wielding that privilege. And privilege absolutely plays a role in building social movements. People with privilege are precisely the ones who should be laying themselves on the line for change, because they're more insulated from consequences. The people with more resources and protection, whose lives wouldn't be destroyed by an arrest record or who have a good enough lawyer to avoid a record altogether, should be the ones taking these hits. Young people of color also face greater risks from police when protesting. Not only are white-led protests more welcomed and protected, but if and when they do face suppression, people tend to be much more outraged by it. That outrage then translates into more support for the movement and better outcomes. In 2020, Portland's Wall of Moms drew national attention while protecting BLM protesters because those mostly white suburban moms understood that putting their categorically non-threatening bodies between other protesters and police would be a means to use their privilege for greater good. And also draw more outrage, because the public has been desensitized to seeing black and brown bodies brutalized by cops, but a white suburban mom facing off with a cop in riot gear? We won't stand for that. For all the vitriol from some, student protesters are still hugely inspiring to many people. We tend to fetishize youth pretty hard in this country. We love the possibilities that young people represent. We admire the clarity with which they see the world and the hope that they have. That being said, I think it's important to really examine why we place so much burden of fixing the world onto younger generations. I'm a millennial. I was a climate activist in college. I remember when that burden was on our shoulders. Why do we do that? I sent out a survey to my channel viewers and over 2,500 of you responded. In it, I asked what was giving people hope in 3 words or less. The most common response was young people. And I'm not saying it's bad to find hope in the younger generation, but why are they the ones taking this on? What are we doing if they're the ones who are going to save us? Just sitting around waiting to die? It's very strange to me, and I would challenge anyone who says the younger generation will save us to question that logic and maybe think a bit more critically about all our roles in standing up against injustice. In their book, This is an Uprising, How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century, Mark and Paul Engler explain that successful protest movements thrive at the nexus of disruption and sacrifice. And though activists are constantly sacrificing their time, money, and emotional bandwidth, those contributions aren't always visible. Parking yourself at an encampment and getting dragged away in handcuffs makes those sacrifices visible, and therefore more tangible and impactful. So while it's important to change policy and write new laws, raising awareness and garnering support is an essential part of that. And acts of civil disobedience, that is breaking the law, does that better than pretty much anything else. Gandhi's approach to nonviolent resistance recognized suffering as a core source of social power. Martin Luther King adopted that belief, frequently preaching that unearned suffering is redemptive. For nonviolent activists, harnessing that power means being willing to face physical suffering rather than seeking to impose it. The very act of breaking the law, of inconveniencing people, of standing up against the status quo and being punished for it publicly and often brutally for the world to see, is an effective means of generating change. Not to imply that cops tear gassing and zip tying students is good, just to point out that backlash is part of what makes movements effective. Gandhi knew it, MLK knew it, and the student protesters know it too. In general, when bystanders see someone in front of them suffering, it's often tough for them to stay detached and uninvolved. The very nature of the scene compels them to pick a side. Calling for divestment is a good strategy because it involves students maximizing their leverage. The school they pay to attend is in their direct sphere of influence in a way that political leaders aren't, because political leaders aren't in anyone's sphere of influence whose net worth lands them in the bottom 99%. Speaking of our elected leaders, Joe Biden held a last-minute press conference in which he made clear that these student protests would make no difference in his stance on the Israel war on Palestine. And on May 1st, the House of Representatives passed a bill called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would empower the federal government to crack down on anti-Israel protests on campuses by codifying a definition of anti-Semitism that encompasses not just threats against Jews, but also certain criticisms of Israel itself. Representative Michael Lawler, Republican from New York and the bill's lead sponsor, said, "We must give the Department of Education the tools to hold college administrators accountable for refusing to address anti-Semitism on their campuses," which is ironic given the Republican Party's gunning for getting rid of the Department of Education because it wields too much power, but sure. The thing is, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act wasn't a Republican-led and passed bill. The bill soared through the House by a vote of 320 to 91, with a majority of Democrats joining Republicans. The bill would, among other things, allow for the Department of Education to revoke federal funding to universities who allow certain types of speech on campus, including, among other things, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. It's unclear whether the bill would pass in the Senate, and it would certainly be met very swiftly with First Amendment challenges in court, but it is alarming to see the pro-Israel consensus among our elected officials is so fierce that they are willing to pass blatantly unconstitutional laws to protect the state of Israel from criticism. That is some dystopian shit, y'all. So it's clear our elected officials have lost the fucking plot, yet again. You can call them to shame them for their vote in the House and urge those in the Senate not to support this bill. But as I always suggest when the system fails us all, you can also turn to mutual aid. Project 𝗦𝗦𝗡𝗏 is a 501c3 organization that connects you directly with families seeking aid in Gaza. You can find them on Instagram under the handle @projectwater.melon. Shout out to my newest supporters on Patreon and on YouTube, as well as supporters in my royal tiers, and a very special shout out to my multi-platinum supporters T, Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, and Brett Piontek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you like this video, you'll also like my video all about how political violence is ruining democracy. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.